The house was always quiet at night, too quiet. It wasn't the comforting silence of a peaceful home, but the suffocating stillness of a place devoid of love. The small two-story house sat at the end of a suburban street, its peeling paint and unkempt lawn standing in stark contrast to the neat homes around it. Inside, an 8-year-old boy named Liam stared at the ceiling of his tiny bedroom, his stomach growling louder than the creaks of the old house. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second feeling like an eternity. Liam curled up under the thin blanket, clutching a locket that used to belong to his mother. The locket was the only thing he had left from her, a small piece of a life that felt like a distant dream. He had lived with Ms. Harding, his foster mom, for 2 months, but every day felt like an uphill battle for survival, a harsh reality. Ms. Harding wasn't the kind of woman you'd expect to open her home to a child in need. She had a stern face that rarely broke into a smile and a voice that carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. Her house was meticulously clean, but not in a welcoming way. It felt more like a museum where touching anything was forbidden. The social workers who visited saw the clean floors, the tidy rooms, and the stocked refrigerator. They nodded approvingly, satisfied that Liam was in a stable environment. What they didn't see was the hunger in Liam's eyes, or the fear that kept him silent. Liam wasn't allowed to eat unless Ms. Harding gave him permission, and her portions were always small, barely enough to keep him going. If he ever asked for more, her response was always the same. "You think money grows on trees, boy. Be grateful you're eating it all." He tried to be grateful. He really did. But no amount of gratitude could silence the gnawing pain in his stomach. The incident. One fateful evening, Liam sat at the small dining table, staring at the dry slice of bread and thin soup that made up his dinner. Ms. Harding sat across from him, scrolling through her phone as she sipped on a cup of tea. The aroma of her rich, buttery toast filled the room, mocking Liam's meager meal. "Eat up," she said without looking up. "You've got school tomorrow." Liam nodded, his hand trembling as he picked up the spoon. He forced himself to eat slowly, knowing that once the food was gone, the hunger would return. But no matter how slow he ate, the bowl was empty in minutes. He glanced at Ms. Harding, hesitating. "What?" she snapped, her eyes finally meeting his. "May I have just a little more soup?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Harding's face darkened. She leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a sneer. "You've got some nerve, kid. Asking for more. Do you know how much that soup costs? You're lucky I'm feeding you at all." Liam lowered his gaze, muttering an apology. He knew better than to argue. After dinner, he retreated to his room, his stomach still rumbling. But the hunger was too much to bear. For hours, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, until finally, he couldn't take it anymore. A risky move. The house was silent as Liam crept out of bed, his bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floor. He tiptoed down the hallway, pausing at the top of the stairs to listen for any sign of movement. When he was certain Ms. Harding was asleep, he descended the stairs, each creak of the steps sending a jolt of fear through his chest. The kitchen was dark, but the faint glow of the moon through the window was enough to guide him. He opened the pantry door slowly, careful not to make a sound. His eyes scanned the shelves, finally landing on a loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it was enough to quiet his growling stomach. Liam reached out, his hand trembling with both hunger and fear. Just as his fingers brushed the plastic packaging, the kitchen light flicked on. "What do you think you're doing?" Ms. Harding's voice was cold and sharp, freezing Liam in place. He turned slowly, his wide, tearful eyes meeting her furious glare. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disdain. I was hungry," Liam stammered, his voice barely audible. Ms. Harding marched over and snatched the loaf of bread from his hands. "Hungry? You've already eaten. Do you think this is some kind of charity? You're nothing but a burden, boy." Her words cut deeper than any knife. Liam tried to apologize, but the lump in his throat made it impossible to speak. Miss Harding pointed to the stairs. "Get back to your room. Now. And don't think you're getting anything tomorrow, either." Tears streaming down his face, Liam obeyed. He climbed the stairs, his legs feeling like lead. Back in his room, he curled up under the blanket, clutching his mother's locket. He whispered a quiet prayer, asking for strength, for hope, for something to change. A silent witness. What Liam didn't know was that someone had been watching. Earlier that day, his teacher, Ms. Rivera, had noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the way he clutched his stomach during class. She had asked him if everything was okay, but Liam had only nodded, forcing a smile. Ms. Rivera wasn't convinced. She had seen children like Liam before, children who carried the weight of their struggles in silence. That evening, as she graded papers at her desk, Liam's face lingered in her mind. She decided to make a call to Child Protective Services, voicing her concerns. "I don't have concrete proof," she admitted, "but something doesn't feel right. Please, just check on him." A glimmer of hope. The next morning, Liam sat at the breakfast table, staring at the empty plate in front of him. True to her word, Ms. Harding hadn't given him anything to eat. She sat across from him, sipping her coffee, her expression as cold as ever. Just as Liam was about to leave for school, there was a knock at the door. Ms. Harding frowned, clearly not expecting visitors. She opened the door to find a social worker and a police officer standing on the porch. "Ms. Harding," the social worker asked, "we've received a report about possible neglect in your home. We'd like to speak with you and Liam." Ms. Harding's face turned pale, but she quickly composed herself. "This is ridiculous," she said with a forced smile. "I take excellent care of that boy." The social worker wasn't convinced. "We'll need to speak with Liam alone." For the first time in weeks, Liam felt a glimmer of hope. He looked at the social worker, his small frame trembling, but his eyes filled with a newfound courage. He clutched his mother's locket tightly, as if drawing strength from her memory. "I'll tell you everything," he said softly, setting the stage for change. This is just the beginning of Liam's journey, a story of resilience, courage, and the unexpected kindness that would change his life forever. Stay tuned to see how one small act of bravery could spark a transformation not only for Liam but for everyone around him. The door swung shut behind the social worker and police officer as they stepped into the living room, their professional demeanor masking the concern brewing beneath the surface. Liam sat on the couch, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized cushions. His eyes darted between Miss Harding and the visitors, unsure of what would happen next. "Liam," the social worker began, her voice gentle, "my name is Ms. Bennett, and I'm here to make sure you're okay. Can you tell me about your life here with Ms. Harding?" Liam hesitated, clutching his mother's locket as though it were a shield. He glanced at Ms. Harding, whose icy glare sent shivers down his spine. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her displeasure radiating like a storm cloud. Liam felt his voice caught in his throat. "It's okay," Ms. Bennett said softly, kneeling to meet his eye level. "You're safe with me. No one can hurt you here." Her words, though gentle, felt like a challenge to the invisible chains that kept Liam silent. He took a deep breath, his small fingers nervously tracing the engraved pattern on the locket. The voice of truth. "Sometimes," Liam started, his voice barely audible, "she doesn't let me eat. She says I'm lucky to even be here." The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock. Miss Harding crossed her arms, her face contorted in an exaggerated expression of shock. "That's absurd," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "He's just a troubled boy. He makes things up for attention." Ms. Bennett didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked on Liam, radiating patience and understanding. "It's okay, Liam," she encouraged. "Tell me more." Liam swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Last night, I was hungry. I tried to get some bread, But she caught me. She yelled and said I couldn't eat today because of it. Ms. Harding's face flushed red, her mask of composure slipping. This is outrageous. He's lying to make me look bad. The police officer, standing quietly by the door, finally spoke. Ms. Harding, we'll need to verify these claims. If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind us looking around. Her protest died on her lips. With a huff, she stormed into the kitchen, muttering under her breath. The officer followed, while Ms. Bennett stayed with Liam, uncovering the evidence. In the kitchen, the officer opened the refrigerator. It was full. Milk, eggs, vegetables, and neatly packed leftovers. To an untrained eye, it would seem like an ordinary, well-stocked home. But the officer noticed something odd. Why are all the containers labeled with dates that don't match? He asked, pointing to several boxes. Ms. Harding, clearly flustered, waved her hand dismissively. I like to keep things organized. Is that a crime? Ignoring her defensive tone, the officer moved to the pantry. The shelves were similarly stocked, but some items looked untouched, their seals unbroken. It was as though the food existed only for show. Meanwhile, Ms. Bennett gently asked Liam a few more questions. Do you go to bed hungry often? She asked. Liam nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. I try to make the food last, but it's never enough. Have you told anyone else about this? She asked. No, Liam whispered. I was scared. Ms. Bennett placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You're very brave for speaking up now. A ticking clock. The investigation moved quickly. The officer returned from the kitchen, signaling Ms. Bennett to join him in the hallway. Ms. Harding, now pacing the living room, glared at them suspiciously. I think we have enough to warrant further action, the officer said quietly. We'll need to remove the boy for his safety while we conduct a thorough investigation. Ms. Bennett nodded. I'll handle it. Re-entering the living room, Ms. Bennett approached Liam with a calm smile. Liam, we're going to take you somewhere safe for now, okay? You won't have to stay here anymore. Liam's heart raced. Relief and fear collided in his chest. Will she come with me? He asked, glancing nervously at Ms. Harding. No, Ms. Bennett reassured him. You'll be with people who will take good care of you. Ms. Harding erupted. This is insane. I've done nothing wrong. You have no right to take him. The officer stepped in, his voice firm but measured. Ms. Harding, we're acting in the child's best interest. If everything checks out, you can discuss this with us later. A new beginning. As Liam was escorted out of the house, the weight of the past 2 months seemed to lift from his small shoulders. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Ms. Harding's angry shouts faded into the background as the car pulled away, leaving the dark chapter of his life behind. The car ride was silent at first. Liam clutched his locket, his fingers brushing against the tiny photograph of his mother inside. Ms. Bennett noticed his nervousness and spoke gently. Do you have anything you'd like to bring with you, Liam? Something that's special to you? This, Liam said, holding up the locket. It's from my mom. Ms. Bennett smiled warmly. That's a beautiful locket. Your mom must have loved you very much. Liam nodded, his throat tightening. He wanted to say more, but the words wouldn't come. A safe haven. They arrived at a modest house on the outskirts of town, its warm glow standing in stark contrast to Ms. Harding's cold, sterile home. The door opened, revealing a kind-faced woman in her 50s. Her name was Mrs. Henderson, and she radiated a warmth that immediately put Liam at ease. Welcome, Liam, she said, kneeling to his level. We're so happy to have you here. Inside, the house was cozy and inviting, filled with soft furniture and family photos. The smell of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air, making Liam's stomach rumble. Mrs. Henderson led him to the kitchen, where a plate of cookies and a glass of milk awaited him. You must be hungry, she said, her tone gentle. Liam hesitated, glancing at Ms. Bennett for approval. When she nodded, he tentatively reached for a cookie. The first bite brought tears to his eyes. It wasn't just the taste, it was the kindness behind the gesture. For the first time in months, he felt seen and cared for. Adjusting to a new life. Over the next few days, Liam began to settle into his new environment. Mrs. Henderson was patient and attentive, always making sure he felt safe. She encouraged him to share his thoughts and feelings, but she never pushed him. One evening, as they sat on the couch reading, Mrs. Henderson noticed Liam clutching his locket. "Would you like to tell me about your mom?" she asked. Liam hesitated but then nodded. "She was the best mom. She always made sure I had enough to eat, even when we didn't have much. She gave me this locket so I'd always remember her." Mrs. Henderson smiled, her eyes misty. "She sounds like a wonderful woman. I'm sure she's very proud of you." Liam felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time since his mother's death, he felt like he belonged. Reflection and hope. As the days turned into weeks, Liam began to thrive. He started drawing again, filling pages with colorful sketches of people, places, and dreams. Mrs. Henderson encouraged his creativity, framing his favorite pieces and displaying them around the house. Meanwhile, the investigation into Miss Harding's actions continued. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she faced charges for child neglect. Liam didn't dwell on her anymore. His focus was on the future. One night, as he lay in bed, Liam opened his locket and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." He knew she would always be with him, guiding him through life's challenges. The early morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across Liam's new room. It was the first time in months he'd woken up to peace instead of hunger or fear. The soft bed, colorful walls, and neatly stacked books on the desk felt like a dream compared to the cold, bare space he had called his room at Miss Harding's house. As he stretched and rubbed his eyes, the smell of bacon and pancakes wafted up from the kitchen. It was a smell he associated with family, a concept he had nearly forgotten. Tentatively, Liam got out of bed, his small feet sinking into the plush rug. For a moment, he paused, clutching his locket. Could this really be home? He wondered. A morning like no other. Downstairs, Mrs. Henderson was humming softly as she flipped pancakes on the griddle. The kitchen was alive with warmth and light, the kind that made the soul feel safe. As Liam peeked around the corner, she turned and greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning, Liam. Did you sleep well?" "Yes, Mom," he replied, his voice shy but genuine. "Come, have a seat," she said, motioning to the table. "Breakfast is ready." Liam hesitated. The food looked too good to be real. Fluffy pancakes, crispy bacon, and a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't had such a meal in as long as he could remember. Mrs. Henderson noticed his hesitation and knelt beside him. "It's all yours, sweetheart," she said gently. "You don't have to ask or wait for permission. In this house, you'll always have enough." Tears stung Liam's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, nodding. He sat down and took his first bite. The sweet syrup and soft pancake melted in his mouth, and for the first time, he felt something he couldn't quite name, a combination of relief, gratitude, and hope. Trust takes time. While Mrs. Henderson made every effort to create a loving environment, Liam found it difficult to let his guard down. His experiences with Miss Harding had left invisible scars, and though he was now safe, those scars ran deep. One afternoon, Mrs. Henderson handed Liam a small notebook and a pack of colored pencils. "I notice you like to draw," she said with a kind smile. "Why don't you show me what you can create?" Liam hesitated, unsure if this was a test. In Miss Harding's house, anything he enjoyed was taken away or used against him. But Mrs. Henderson's eyes held no malice, only encouragement. Slowly, he opened the notebook and began to draw. Over the next hour, he filled the first page with a picture of a treehouse surrounded by flowers. It was simple but vibrant, each stroke of the pencil a small step toward healing. When he finished, Mrs. Henderson clapped her hands softly. "It's beautiful, Liam. You have an incredible talent." Liam's cheeks turned red. "Do you really think so?" "I do," she said earnestly, "and I think the world deserves to see your gift." Her words planted a tiny seed of confidence in Liam, a seed that would take time to grow. School days. Returning to school was another hurdle. While Liam's teacher, Ms. Rivera, was thrilled to see him in a healthier environment, the other kids weren't always kind. They teased him for being small, quiet, and different. One day, during recess, a group of boys cornered him near the swings. "Hey, foster kid," one of them sneered. "Did your new mom pick you out of the trash?" Liam clenched his fists, his face burning with shame. He wanted to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. Before he could respond, another voice rang out. "Leave him alone." A girl with curly hair and a fierce expression stepped between Liam and the bullies. "Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" The boys muttered something under their breath before retreating. The girl turned to Liam and offered a hand. "I'm Ava. Don't let them get to you. They're just jerks." Liam managed a small smile. "Thanks." Ava shrugged. "No big deal. Wanna play soccer?" From that day on, Ava became Liam's first real friend. She didn't pry into his past or treat him like a charity case. She simply saw him for who he was, a quiet boy with a talent for drawing and a heart that longed to belong. Unexpected kindness. One evening after dinner, Mrs. Henderson sat down with Liam to discuss an upcoming art competition at the local community center. "I think you should enter," she said, sliding the flyer across the table. Liam shook his head. "I'm not good enough." "Nonsense," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Your art is incredible, Liam. This could be a chance to show people what you're capable of." The idea terrified him. What if people laughed at his work? What if he failed? But Mrs. Henderson's unwavering belief in him sparked something inside, a small voice that whispered, "What if you succeed?" After much encouragement, Liam decided to give it a try. He spent the next 2 weeks pouring his heart into a piece that depicted a young boy standing under a treehouse, looking up at the stars. It was a reflection of his journey, a mix of loneliness, hope, and wonder. The day of the competition, the community center buzzed with activity as artists of all ages displayed their work. Liam stood nervously by his easel, his palms sweaty as people passed by. Some stopped to admire his piece, their kind words giving him a glimmer of confidence. When the judges announced the winners, Liam held his breath. He didn't win first place, but he was awarded an honorable mention for his creativity and emotional depth. As he walked up to receive his certificate, the applause filled his chest with a warmth he hadn't felt before. Mrs. Henderson hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Liam. This is just the beginning." A letter that changed everything. A week after the competition, Liam received an unexpected letter. It was from a local art gallery owner who had seen his work at the event. The letter read, "Dear Liam, your piece at the community center deeply moved me. I would be honored to showcase your work in our upcoming youth exhibit. Please let me know if you're interested. Best regards, Mr. Ellis." Liam stared at the letter in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson beamed with pride. "See, I told you your art could touch people." The gallery exhibit became a turning point in Liam's life. His work was displayed alongside other young artists, and for the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The experience gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to dream again, a reflection on resilience. As Liam stood in the gallery, surrounded by his artwork, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his mother, whose love had given him the strength to endure. He thought about Ms. Harding, whose cruelty had taught him the value of kindness. And he thought about Mrs. Henderson, whose unwavering support had shown him that even broken hearts can heal. Liam still had a long way to go, but he was no longer defined by his past. He was an artist, a friend, and a boy with a future brighter than he ever imagined. The gallery exhibition had been a whirlwind experience for Liam, and for the first time in his life, he felt like his talent mattered. The world was no longer a cold, unwelcoming place. It had potential, opportunities, and even kindness. Yet, with new beginnings came new challenges, and Liam was about to face one of the most defining moments of his young life. A surprise visit. A few weeks after the exhibition, Liam was sitting at the kitchen table, working on a new sketch. Mrs. Henderson had just placed a glass of milk and a plate of cookies beside him when the doorbell rang. She excused herself to answer it, and Liam thought nothing of it until he heard voices that sounded familiar. Curious, he peeked around the corner and froze. Standing in the doorway was Miss Harding, her arms crossed and her face a mask of defiance. Behind her stood a man in a suit, her lawyer. "I'm here to discuss Liam," Miss Harding said, her tone curt. Mrs. Henderson didn't flinch. "Liam is under my care now. If you have any concerns, you should speak with Child Protective Services." "I intend to," Ms. Harding snapped, "but I have rights too, and I'll fight for him if I have to." Liam's heart sank. The thought of returning to Ms. Harding's home was unbearable. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with memories of cold dinners and harsh words. Mrs. Henderson noticed him peeking from the corner and gave him a reassuring nod. "Liam," she said gently, "why don't you go to your room for a bit? I'll handle this." Reluctantly, Liam obeyed, but he stayed close enough to hear the conversation. "A battle begins." Ms. Harding's lawyer explained that she was seeking custody again, claiming she had been unfairly treated during the initial investigation. "My client has the means and the right to care for Liam," he argued. Mrs. Henderson remained calm. The investigation revealed neglect, and Liam himself expressed his unhappiness under Ms. Harding's care. His well-being must come first. The conversation grew heated, but Mrs. Henderson never wavered. She refused to be intimidated, knowing Liam's safety and happiness were at stake. Eventually, Ms. Harding and her lawyer left, but they made it clear they weren't giving up. That evening, Mrs. Henderson sat with Liam on the couch. "You might hear some things in the coming weeks that could be upsetting," she said gently. "But I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to protect you. You're not alone in this." Tears filled Liam's eyes. "I don't want to go back to her," he whispered. "You won't," Mrs. Henderson promised. "We'll fight this together." The power of a community. The news of Ms. Harding's custody battle spread quickly through the small town, and it wasn't long before Liam's story reached the local community. Parents at Liam's school, neighbors, and even strangers who had seen his artwork rally behind him. Ms. Rivera, Liam's teacher, organized a petition, gathering signatures from those who believed Liam deserved a safe and loving home. Ava, his best friend, started a fundraiser to cover any legal fees Mrs. Henderson might face. Even the gallery owner, Mr. Ellis, offered to host a special event to raise awareness. For the first time, Liam saw how much people cared about him. Their support gave him strength, but it also made him nervous. He didn't want to disappoint anyone or let them down. Facing the court. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and Liam found himself sitting in a courtroom, his small hands clutching his locket tightly. Mrs. Henderson sat beside him, her presence a steady source of comfort. Across the room, Ms. Harding sat with her lawyer, her expression smug and self-assured. Liam couldn't understand why she was fighting for him now, after months of treating him like an inconvenience. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. Ms. Harding's lawyer argued that she had been misjudged, presenting photographs of her clean home and well-stocked pantry as evidence of her ability to care for Liam. But then it was Mrs. Henderson's turn. She spoke passionately about the neglect Liam had endured and the progress he had made in her care. She presented letters from Liam's teacher, his social worker, and even Ava, all attesting to the positive changes in his life. Finally, it was Liam's turn to speak. He stood hesitantly, his small voice trembling as he addressed the court. "I don't want to go back to Miss Harding," he said. "She didn't care about me. She only cared about looking good to other people. But Mrs. Henderson, she makes me feel safe. She lets me draw. And she tells me I'm important. I just want to stay with her." His words hung in the air, raw and honest. The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. The verdict. After hours of deliberation, the judge made his decision. Liam would remain in Mrs. Henderson's care, with Ms. Harding's custody request denied. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, and Liam felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Ms. Harding stormed out without a word, her lawyer trailing behind her. Mrs. Henderson hugged Liam tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You're staying right here, Liam," she whispered. "You're home." A new mission. The ordeal had taken its toll on Liam, but it also ignited something within him, a desire to help others like himself. With Mrs. Henderson's encouragement, he began speaking at community events, sharing his story and advocating for better foster care policies. One day, he stood in front of a crowd at the gallery, his artwork displayed behind him. "When I was with Miss Harding, I felt invisible," he said. "But thanks to Mrs. Henderson and so many kind people, I learned that I matter. Every child deserves to feel that way." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom were moved to tears. After the event, a woman approached him, holding the hand of a young boy. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "My son is in foster care too, and he's been struggling. Hearing you speak gave him hope." Liam knelt to the boy's level and smiled. "You're not alone," he said, "and you're stronger than you think." A bright future. As the months passed, Liam continued to thrive. He excelled in school, grew closer to Ava and his other friends, and even began mentoring younger kids at the community center. His artwork gained more recognition, and he started dreaming of a career as an artist and advocate. One evening, as he and Mrs. Henderson sat on the porch watching the sunset, Liam turned to her and said, "Thank you for everything. You saved me." Mrs. Henderson smiled, her eyes filled with love. "You saved yourself, Liam. I just gave you the tools." Liam looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in his life, the future felt full of promise. The weeks following the custody hearing were some of the happiest of Liam's young life. For the first time, he didn't have to look over his shoulder, wondering if he'd be scolded or ignored. Mrs. Henderson had made sure he knew that he was home for good. Yet, with his newfound sense of security came a question that lingered in his mind. What happens to other kids like me? A spark of purpose. One evening, as Liam sat in his room working on a new sketch, Mrs. Henderson knocked gently on the door. "Liam, there's someone here to see you." Curious, Liam followed her to the living room, where a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard waited. She introduced herself as Miss Clark, a representative from a local child welfare organization. "We've heard about your story, Liam," she said warmly, "and we're so inspired by how brave you've been. We'd love for you to share your experience at one of our upcoming events." Liam hesitated. Speaking in front of a crowd wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing. But Mrs. Henderson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You have a powerful story, Liam. Sharing it could help so many others." After a moment's thought, Liam nodded. "I'll do it," he said quietly. Preparing to speak, over the next few weeks, Liam worked with Ms. Clark to prepare for the event. They practiced in the living room, with Mrs. Henderson offering encouragement from the couch. At first, Liam stumbled over his words, nervous about sharing such personal memories. But as he practiced, his confidence grew. "I'm not just telling my story," he realized one evening as he looked at the notes he'd written. "I'm giving other kids hope." The day of the event arrived, and Liam found himself standing backstage at a large community center. The auditorium was packed with people, social workers, foster parents, and even children in the foster care system. The buzz of conversation filled the air, but Liam's heart pounded loudly in his ears. "You'll do great," Mrs. Henderson said, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Just speak from your heart." When his name was announced, Liam stepped onto the stage, the bright lights making it hard to see the faces in the crowd. He took a deep breath and began. "My name is Liam," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "And I used to think I didn't matter." He shared his story, how he had lost his mother, endured neglect under Miss Harding's care, and finally found hope and love with Mrs. Henderson. As he spoke, he noticed heads nodding in the audience, tears glistening in some eyes. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause. An unlikely connection. After the event, a boy about Liam's age approached him, accompanied by a tired-looking woman. The boy's clothes were clean but slightly too big, and his eyes held a sadness Liam recognized all too well. "Hi," the boy said shyly. "I'm Ethan." "Hi, Ethan," Liam replied with a smile. "Thanks for coming." Ethan hesitated, then said, "I'm in foster care too." "Your story. It made me feel like maybe things can get better." "They can," Liam said earnestly. "You just have to hold on, even when it's hard." The woman, who introduced herself as Ethan's foster mom, thanked Liam for sharing his story. "You gave him hope today," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. That night, as Liam lay in bed, he thought about Ethan. He realized that for every person who had helped him, he now had the chance to pay it forward. A growing platform. Word of Liam's speech spread quickly, and soon he was invited to speak at other events. He even appeared on a local news segment, where he shared his journey and encouraged viewers to support foster children in their communities. With each appearance, Liam grew more confident. He started to see himself not just as a survivor, but as an advocate, a voice for kids who felt like they didn't have one. Using art to inspire. While Liam's speeches were impactful, his true passion remained his art. One day, he had an idea. What if he used his drawings to tell stories about foster care? With Mrs. Henderson's help, he started a small project, creating a series of illustrations that depicted moments from his journey. One piece showed a small boy reaching for a loaf of bread in a dark kitchen. Another depicted a kind woman opening her home to a scared child. Each drawing was accompanied by a short story or message of hope. When Liam shared his work online, it quickly gained attention. People from all over the country reached out, sharing how his art had touched them. Some were foster parents, others were former foster children, and many were simply moved by his resilience. An unexpected opportunity. One day, Liam received an email from a national child advocacy organization. They had seen his artwork and wanted to feature it in their annual campaign to raise awareness about foster care. "We believe your story and talent could inspire thousands," the email read. "Would you be interested in collaborating with us?" Liam was stunned. The idea of his art reaching so many people was overwhelming, but Mrs. Henderson encouraged him to seize the opportunity. "This is your chance to make an even bigger difference," she said. With her support, Liam agreed. The campaign launched a few months later, featuring his illustrations on posters, social media, and even billboards. The tagline read, "Every child deserves a home where they can thrive." A full circle moment. One afternoon, while attending a community event, Liam was approached by a woman in her 30s. She introduced herself as Sarah, a former foster child who now worked as a social worker. "Your story reminds me so much of my own," she said. "I grew up thinking no one cared about me, but someone took a chance on me, just like Mrs. Henderson did for you. Now, I try to do the same for kids like us." Hearing her words, Liam felt a deep sense of connection. "It's like we're all part of a chain," he said. "One person helps another, and it keeps going." "That's the beauty of it," Sarah replied. "You're continuing the chain." Looking to the future, as Liam grew older, his commitment to foster care advocacy only deepened. He started a nonprofit organization that combined his love for art with his desire to help others. The organization, called Canvas of Hope, provided art supplies and creative workshops for foster children, giving them an outlet to express themselves. By the time Liam turned 18, he had already made a lasting impact. His artwork had been featured in galleries across the country, and his advocacy work had influenced local policies to improve the foster care system. On the day of his high school graduation, Mrs. Henderson handed him a wrapped gift. Inside was a framed picture of one of his first drawings, the treehouse surrounded by flowers. "You've come so far, Liam," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I know this is just the beginning." The ripple effect. Liam's story didn't just change his life. It changed countless others. Kids like Ethan found hope in his words. Foster parents found inspiration in his journey. And communities rallied together to support vulnerable children, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples of change. As Liam looked out at the horizon, he felt a sense of purpose that he knew would guide him for the rest of his life. He was no longer a boy who thought he didn't matter. He was an artist, an advocate, and a testament to the power of resilience and love. The years flew by like pages in a well-read book. Liam, once a small boy clutching a locket in fear, had grown into a young man with a purpose. His life was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound impact of love and kindness. But Liam wasn't content with just surviving. He was determined to ensure that no child ever felt as invisible as he once had. The nonprofit that changed lives. Liam's nonprofit, Canvas of Hope, had become a beacon for foster children across the country. What started as a small project providing art supplies to foster kids had grown into a nationwide movement. Art centers were established in several cities, offering workshops, counseling, and mentorship programs for children navigating the foster care system. One summer afternoon, Liam visited one of these centers in Chicago. The walls were covered in vibrant artwork created by children whose lives had been touched by Canvas of Hope. Liam walked through the room, marveling at the raw emotion and creativity on display. "Mr. Liam," a young girl called out, running up to him. She held up a painting of a bright red heart surrounded by rays of sunlight. "This is beautiful," Liam said, kneeling to her level. "What's the story behind it?" The girl beamed. "It's about finding love, even when it feels like the world is dark." Liam's heart swelled with pride. "That's a powerful message. You should be very proud of yourself." The girl nodded, her confidence shining. "I am." Moments like these reminded Liam why he had started Canvas of Hope, to give children a voice and show them they mattered. An unexpected reunion. One evening, Liam was sorting through mail in his modest apartment when a letter caught his eye. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting was familiar. Slowly, he opened it and began to read. "Dear Liam, I've been following your story for years, and I can't express how proud I am of the person you've become. I know I hurt you deeply, and there's no excuse for my actions. But I want you to know that I've changed. I've been attending counseling, and I've been working to understand the damage I caused. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope we can talk someday. Sincerely, Ms. Harding." Liam stared at the letter, emotions swirling inside him. The anger and pain he had buried long ago resurfaced, but so did a sense of curiosity. Could people truly change? Did she deserve a chance to explain? He decided to speak with Mrs. Henderson, who had always been his guiding light. Sitting across from her in the cozy living room, where so many of his fears had been soothed, he handed her the letter. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. Mrs. Henderson studied the letter carefully before responding. "Only you can decide that, Liam. Forgiveness is a powerful thing, but it doesn't mean forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of the past." Liam nodded. After a long moment of reflection, he made his decision. The meeting. A week later, Liam met Ms. Harding at a small cafe. She looked different. Her once stern expression had softened, and her posture was less rigid. When she saw Liam, she stood and extended her hand, but he hesitated before sitting across from her. "Thank you for meeting me," Ms. Harding began, her voice quieter than he remembered. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am." Liam listened as she recounted her struggles, how she had grown up in a household where love was scarce and discipline was harsh. "I didn't know how to care for you," she admitted, tears in her eyes. "I was so focused on my own pain that I couldn't see yours." For a long time, Liam said nothing. The pain of her neglect still lingered, but as he looked at her, he saw not the monster he had feared as a child, but a broken woman trying to make amends. "I can't forget what happened," Liam said finally, "but I can see you're trying to change, and I hope you continue to do so." Ms. Harding nodded, her tears falling freely. "Thank you, Liam. That means more than you know." The meeting didn't erase the past, but it brought Liam a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. Building bridges. The encounter with Ms. Harding inspired Liam to expand the reach of Canvas of Hope. He realized that helping foster children also meant addressing the root causes of neglect and abuse. He partnered with organizations that provided support for struggling parents, offering workshops on positive parenting and emotional resilience. One such program, called Bridges of Healing, brought together former foster children and parents who wanted to learn from their experiences. Liam often spoke at these sessions, sharing his story and encouraging open dialogue. At one event, a young mother approached him, holding the hand of her toddler. "I never thought I could be a good mom," she admitted, "but hearing your story gave me hope. I want to do better for her." Liam smiled. "The fact that you're here shows how much you care. That's the first step." Recognition and growth. Liam's work didn't go unnoticed. He was invited to speak at national conferences, received awards for his advocacy, and even published a book titled Canvas of Hope, A Journey from Darkness to Light. The book combined his artwork with stories from his life, offering inspiration to readers around the world. Despite his growing fame, Liam remained grounded. He continued to visit Canvas of Hope centers regularly, spending time with the children who reminded him of his younger self. He often told them, "You are not defined by your circumstances. You are defined by your strength." A message for the future. One day, Liam was invited to speak at his old elementary school, standing in the same auditorium where he had once sat as a scared, hungry boy. He felt a wave of emotion. He addressed the students, teachers, and parents with a message of resilience and hope. "When I was your age," he said, "I felt like the world had forgotten me. But I learned that even in the darkest moments, there is light. Sometimes you just need someone to help you see it." After the speech, a boy approached him, clutching a drawing. It was a picture of a boy holding a locket under a starry sky. "This is for you," the boy said shyly. "You helped me believe in myself." Liam took the drawing, his eyes misty. "Thank you," he said. "This means the world to me." A legacy of kindness. Years later, as Liam looked back on his journey, he marveled at how far he had come. From a frightened boy in Miss Harding's house to an artist, advocate, and mentor, he had transformed his pain into purpose. But more importantly, he had created a legacy of kindness that would continue long after he was gone. On the anniversary of Canvas of Hope's founding, Liam stood in front of a crowd at the organization's flagship center. Behind him was a mural painted by the children, an image of a treehouse surrounded by flowers, just like the one he had drawn as a boy. "This isn't just my story," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's our story. It's about the power of community, the strength of love, and the belief that every child deserves to feel seen, heard, and valued. Together, we can change lives." As the crowd erupted in applause, Liam felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had turned his darkest moments into a source of light for others, proving that even the smallest spark of hope could ignite a lifetime of change.